to do a couple of linear patterns. Yeah, obviously we covered, you know, the main, actually, we covered the main one, the linear pattern. We also have the circular and the fill pattern. Let's create another piece of geometry over here for us to replicate along, let's say along this edge, this dimension. Let's do the pitch. Let's say 3 mil. It's a bit too, actually. You know what? We can go with 3 mil. Let's see how that works out for us. Let's do, no, doesn't like 7, maybe 6. 6, there we go. Just along the surface. Okay, should be good. What happens if we actually select this linear pattern and play around again with the move tool? As you can see, some very interesting things are happening over here, right? You can actually, using the move tool, you can change the count, right, of our selection. Guessing you can also rotate the linear pattern over there if you wanted to do it off of a side plane. You can move it diagonally as well. If I get a nice little view over there and I can actually select some of these axes, that would be good. No, not the rotational. I want the translational one. Yeah, there we go. You can actually move it sideways, move it back and forth. You can move it up and down if you want it to be somewhere in the middle of your section. And again, another useful tool that you can use, right? You see, if you just looked in the workspace, right, this is another, you know, ease of life top tips when using this program. If you just look in the workspace, you just see a cube. You wouldn't be able to see that geometry that we just put in the center of the, you know, rectangular prism or the cube. But if you look in your structure tree, you can see some of that hidden geometry that lies within, you know, in the center. And if you want to you can actually select this geometry and perform, you know, some operations using it, such as a cut operation. If you wanted to go off of that, and then off of this one, you could potentially, you know, do a reverse cut the other way. So from geometric or engineering perspective, what this allows you to do is you can set a center surface off of here where all of these cuts or extrudes start from, right? And if you wanted to, you can also, you don't have to cut, you can create a boss or an extrude, right? You can bring it out this way as well. That one seemed to want to perform a cut. If we specifically say add material, then it adds the material, right? And we seem to have another one over here. There we go. Right. So it gives you something additionally to play around with. Obviously, you can also edit this. Keep some of the geometry that you've drawn with the planes and everything. Let's go back to the move tool. You can also change the spacing between here. This is a locked property if you want to keep it within the plane or move it outside of the plane. Right. But let's go back onto the different pattern options that we've been exploring. Do that. let's delete this pattern that we've created. Let's try to do a new pattern. Let's actually get rid of all of that, because again, the more operations that you do on it, the more history there is, which might actually mess up some of the predictive features of SpaceClaim. Let's go back into the pool option or the pool feature. Okay, so we've replicated our geometry again. Going into sketch, selecting the top surface. Let's actually put a point over here in the center, and let's add just a circle over here. Now let's try to create a linear or a circular pattern, right? Gonna ask me to choose a direction or a line. Let's see if we choose this line. Does it mimic that pattern or that feature? No, it doesn't like that. How about if we actually a linear or a circular pattern might be more suited to a cylinder. So let's just get rid of all of this. Trying to come up with examples on the fly, right? So I'm pretty much practicing with you right now some of these tools. Okay, let's try to create a cylinder. Now let's try to create a linear pattern off of this, right? If we select sketch, does it let me select that face? No. Need to create. There we go. Now let's try to select a sketch off of this plane. There we go. Now let's try circular pattern right now. So choose that. There you go. That gave us a bit of a better result, because obviously it was trying previously when I was using the cube or the rectangular prism. Obviously the tool was asking for an axis of rotation to rotate the feature around, but because we are working with right angles, straight surfaces, SpaceClaim couldn't really understand or predict on what edges or what surfaces to actually replicate that feature on. You know, this is the circular pattern itself. Let's try to modify some of the angles over here. We'll play around with the settings to see kind of what happens. All right, obviously right now we're dealing with angles and how many features we'd like to replicate. So obviously if you want to replicate it all along the axis that you've chosen, you'd select, you know, an angle of 360 degrees. If you want to only replicate it halfway along, you choose an angle of 180 degrees, and software will adapt it to, obviously, to the parameters that you give or that you select. Then, as an example, after we create a nice little geometry, we can select some surfaces on here, and we can play around, you know, see what we can come up with, what we can create, right? Here I'm trying to sort of get each of these to create a hole, but again, it can't predict that I want each of these surface areas to go perpendicular to each selected surface area. Maybe it can be a computational nightmare for the software to do that. Sometimes if one technique that you are trying is not working out, you have to try a different technique, let's say, or a different approach, a different methodology. So you got that. Sometimes it can actually, be detrimental. It can actually, some of the things that you do can actually work out in a wrong way, might not actually work out the way that you intended to do. Can we actually create a linear pattern off of not just 2D geometry or a 2D sketch? Let's try to create a hole through the cylinder, sorry. Let's try to create a circular pattern off of this hole around this axis. Would that give me an interesting result? Right? Seems to not want to recognize that surface or that area. As you can see, obviously sometimes the tools that were given, some of the more complicated or more complex ones, they don't work out to our favor. That's what we're here to do. We're here to practice and understand a bit better what the limitations of each tool is, what each tool allows us to do, right? You'd think that using the linear pattern, if you select a direction, it could replicate, some holes that we drew, but apparently that's not the case. Let's try a linear pattern off of this cube, right? Let's try to do the first example that we did again, but using a hole this time. Okay, so we cut a hole through that direction. Now, can we replicate this hole along this direction? Doesn't want to replicate the hole, it just wants to replicate. Actually it did. It was just showing us a preview, but as you can see with the linear pattern, it was easier for the program to predict what we wanted to do. There were less variables or less computational strain, and it actually allowed us to replicate or mimic that kind of feature. What happens if we try to use the fill pattern, right? Let's try to fill this pattern over here. Yeah, does it give us something interesting? Does it give us an interesting result? Over here it's very similar to the linear pattern, right? But what if, let's say, we were to create a tiny circle over here, right? What will happen if we selected linear pattern off of this, or a fill pattern off of that? Well, it just does not want to figure out what we're doing. It does not want to play nicely with us, unfortunately. Well, now it wanted to fill it. But obviously, you can, as the tool says over here, you can select an edge, a curve, an axis. So you can select many different things. You can even select these axes right here. Apparently it doesn't want to create that pattern because of just the surface. Let's try to just change the pattern options over here. Well, X spacing, maybe 2 mil. How does that change it? Doesn't. Great. 0.5, 0.1. There we go. Y spacing. Yeah. Margin. Margin, I believe, is the space around here, or space around surrounding components. So obviously, as you can see, it can quickly get quite complex or quite difficult using some of these tools to actually achieve some desired results. Obviously, this is why I didn't want to cover it in the main body of the course, because it can lead to a lot of confusion. You know, I just want you to get to grips with the basics, with the main tools that we have covered in the main body of the course. This is just surplus information, additional concepts that you can use, right? But only use them sparingly. As you can see, it can get complicated, it can get confusing. Actually, you can spend a lot of your time learning all of these different tools, and you can still find new things to learn, because there's, you know, always different ways that you can use the tools and different things that you can learn using these tools. So you can see, using this linear pattern, one of the examples that we did previously in week 2 in the surplus informations, we tried to freehand draw an ice cube tray. You can see in that situation, using this fill pattern could potentially make your job a bit easier, and you can sort of lay out a nice little grid a bit nicer. But you know, it could also get a bit more complicated as well. It could create a lot more confusion for you. So obviously, when you're practicing, when you're trying to design something new, obviously play around with some of the tools, but don't get discouraged. There we go. If we can just select these faces, and now there we go. So you see, even I got a bit confused over there, because I did select the linear pattern for my pull operation. It selected all of them, but then when I actually wanted to pull it down, it gave me the arrow just on one box, and it led me to be a bit confused, as I thought SpaceClaim was only gonna affect or edit this one box or this one square. But it's because obviously it selected all of them, but it didn't highlight all of them. I don't understand exactly why it did that. Maybe they'll fix that in a future update of the program. But in essence, all you gotta do is try the technique, hope you get the results that you're looking for. If it doesn't work out well, you can always Control Z, you can undo the action that you just did if it doesn't work out well. But you see, using that linear pattern, we could create quite a big ice box or ice tray, right? Where, you know, actually drawing these out one by one by one by one, you know, would take a long amount of time. This could actually save you a lot of time doing that. So that's another feature, right? Obviously, you have the different spacing between all of these cubes over here. All of this is parameter driven, right? And yeah, it's obviously good practice to set parameters as we've discussed in the course, so you can quickly go back and edit some of these things. All right, so set the move over here, right, this move action, and hopefully that didn't crash my session, but it might have. These are the risks sometimes doing some of these operations, because what SpaceClaim is currently doing, as in this example, I'm trying to move quite a large amount of squares or surface area and geometry on the surface of the square, and SpaceClaim is keeping track of all of these parameters, all of this geometry, is trying to predict what I'm doing, and at the same time trying to keep a lot of the relations that I've previously defined, like the spacing in between the squares, how many squares, everything. And when you also give it a move, it needs to affect every single one of these squares, or what it's actually doing is moving the main square geometry and then redoing the whole linear pattern off of that main square, or that's how the calculations, that's how the parameters are set. So obviously, depending on your computer's performance, your computer specifications, it might struggle to do some of these more complicated moves or tasks that you define, right? Let's clear our workspace and let's play around a bit more just with the parameters now that we've covered some of these pattern tools, albeit with some limited success in the instances where we might find them useful, right? That's the thing that I always like to specify. The main tools that personally I've used and I've seen used in industry are these main sketch tools. As you can see, we've created in the previous example some really complicated 3D and complicated 2D geometry just by using these simple tools. If you try to use some of these more complex tools, obviously you can get a bit more complex geometry, but it starts becoming more complicated, more tedious, starts requiring a bit more effort to actually get the program in line. You might get the program actually crashing on you because the more features that you define, the more memory that's used up, the more computational strain that it puts on the program to remember all of these relationships, all of these dimensions. So try to be wary of that as well. We'll actually go into a bit more depth later on in this course in some of the following weeks about some of the file types that SpaceClaim uses and some of the file types that we actually use in 3D printing, because obviously it's all good and well when you create this 3D model with all of its dimensions, but those dimensions and all of this data that you use to create your models, it takes a lot of memory. And when you're 3D printing, obviously you want these dimensions set, but sometimes you don't want all of those relationships between all the different geometry in your model because it's not necessary. You just want a hard surface copy of your model to be retained, right? Without any of the additional relationships. And you can actually export it into certain file formats which just create a carbon copy, right, or a dummy copy of your model without all of those relations that you can export into a file type which is called STL, and that's mainly used in 3D printing because it just gives the dummy geometry, right, with just the exterior dimensions without any of the relationships, between the geometry and the calculations, right, of how that geometry was created. So by removing some of that geometrical calculation and computation, you can save quite a bit of space in your model. Right, so we've covered the move tool, we've practiced some of the sweep tool and some of the different features of the sweep tool. We've covered some of the other different patterns that you create. Right, mirror, we've pretty much covered what there is to cover with that in the main body of the lesson. Obviously, I just want to give one more final example of something useful that you could have, right? So an example of something that you could create that could be, useful in a real world example or application. So obviously using this polygon tool, we can define some geometry. We can actually create a wrench model if we wanted to, right? Over here, just using some of these, just a simple sketch over here. We can even, let's try to give it an inlet over here for it to actually be able to go over a bolt. Let's just trim these entities here and over here and over here, right? You can create a simple model of a wrench, right? Actually, wait. What I actually should have done, right, is if I select this geometry, right, I could theoretically create a parameter on here, right? So group 1, let's just select that, right? No, not pull. I want to select, go back into sketch. I want to select this sketch, right? I want a parameter of this dimension, yeah. And I want to go back into sketch. For some reason, it just got rid of my groups. Great. Wow. Sometimes, sometimes the program just wants to give you a hard time, right? So group 1, yeah. Let's give that selection. Active parts. Great. So let's go back into sketch. So doesn't want to actually create a parameter off of this dimension for some reason, and I cannot understand why it would not like to do that. Yeah, as we saw in the main body of the lesson, you could have created a parameter off of this, but over here it just creates a named selection, right? Doesn't actually want to create a parameter for me for my dimension, which is very annoying. Yeah, but pretty much, yeah, play around with this. Sometimes you'll have setbacks, as I just did over here, trying to list a couple of parameters or named groups. But don't despair. Just keep cracking on. As with most things, sometimes you can have an off day where things just don't work in your favor, but don't despair. Sometimes it's good to take a break from what you're doing, take 5 minutes, come back to it, try a different approach. Maybe if you restart the program, it would actually do what you intended to do. And that's what I would do in this scenario, because I've been actually modeling for over an hour over here in this practice session. And most likely just because I've been creating geometry, selecting it, deleting it, setting different sketch planes, creating more sketch planes. It's given the program a lot to a lot to think about, and now it just doesn't want to cooperate on some of these issues. But okay, that is what we're going to cover over here for this one. You can have a bit more of a play around yourself in your own time, in your spare time, if you wish. We'll move on and we'll cover some more examples, some more advanced tools next week.